In a small, forgotten village nestled deep within the woods, there stood an ancient house. The house had been abandoned for years, its once vibrant walls now faded and covered in ivy. The townspeople avoided it, whispering about the strange occurrences that had driven the previous owners away. But to Ellie, a curious young girl who had just moved into the village with her parents, the house was a mystery waiting to be solved. Ellie was different from other children her age. While others spent their days playing in the sun, Ellie was drawn to the shadows. She loved exploring dark, hidden places, and the old house seemed like the perfect adventure. One day, after begging her parents for days, they finally gave in and allowed her to explore the house, on the condition that she would be back before dark. With a flashlight in hand, her heart pounding with excitement, Ellie made her way to the house. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and a musty smell filled the air. Inside, the house was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of the floorboards beneath her feet. Dust particles danced in the beams of light that filtered through the broken windows, and the air was thick with an unspoken warning. Ellie wandered from room to room, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. She found nothing of interest until she reached the attic. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Without hesitation, she climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under her weight. The attic was dark, much darker than the rest of the house. The only light came from a small, cracked window at the far end of the room. As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she noticed something strange. In the corner of the attic, there was a large, dusty mirror. It was the kind of mirror that looked like it had seen things, terrible things. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine, but her curiosity got the better of her. She approached the mirror slowly, her reflection becoming clearer with each step. But something was wrong. As she stood in front of it, she realized that her reflection wasn't quite right. It was her, but different. Her reflection's eyes were darker, almost black. There was a sinister smile playing on its lips, a smile that Ellie knew she wasn't making. Suddenly, the reflection began to move on its own. Ellie watched in horror as it reached out a hand, pressing its palm against the inside of the glass. She stumbled back, dropping her flashlight, but the beam of light flickered across something else, something in the corner that she hadn't noticed before. There, huddled in the shadows, was a figure. It was barely visible, more of a shape than a person, but its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Ellie's heart raced as she realized that the figure was watching her, had been watching her since she entered the attic. Paralyzed with fear, Ellie could move as the figure slowly rose from its crouched position. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, and its movements unnaturally slow. It drifted toward her, its eyes never leaving hers. Ellie tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure was only inches away now, its breath cold against her skin. In a moment of sheer terror, Ellie turned and bolted down the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps as she flew through the house. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cool evening air hitting her like a wave. When she finally looked back, the house was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Ellie knew better. She could still feel the icy touch of the figure's breath on her neck, and she knew she had barely escaped with her life. From that day on, Ellie never went near the old house again, but sometimes, late at night, she would catch a glimpse of something in the shadows, a tall, gaunt figure with glowing eyes watching her from the darkness, and she would remember the reflection in the mirror, the sinister smile that wasn't her own. In the village, the whispers continued, but now they included the story of a girl who had seen the shadow in the attic. A shadow that still lingered, waiting for its next victim. This horror story combines elements of psychological terror and supernatural dread, creating an eerie atmosphere that lingers long after the story ends. The Whispering Forest. In a remote countryside, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, there lay a dense, ancient forest known as the Whispering Forest. The villagers nearby spoke of it in hushed tones, warning outsiders never to enter after dark. The forest was said to be cursed, haunted by voices that lured people deep into the woods, never to return. Despite the warnings, a young man named David, who had recently moved to the village to escape his troubled past, found himself drawn to the forest. He had always been a skeptic, dismissing tales of the supernatural as mere superstition. The villager's fear only fueled his curiosity, and one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David decided to explore the forest for himself. With a flashlight in hand and a determined expression, David set off down the narrow path that led into the heart of the forest. The air grew cooler as he ventured deeper, the trees towering above him, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The light from his flashlight barely penetrated the thick darkness, and the silence was almost suffocating. As he walked, David began to notice something strange. The deeper he went, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of the night, crickets, rustling leaves, distant owls, faded away, leaving only an oppressive silence. It was then that he heard it, a faint whisper like the rustling of leaves, but more human. David stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the darkness with his flashlight, but saw nothing. The whispering grew louder, surrounding him, as if the trees themselves were speaking to him. The words were indistinguishable, a murmur of voices blending together, but there was a sense of urgency in them, as if they were trying to tell him something. Shaking off his unease, David pressed on, determined to find the source of the whispers. As he walked, the voices grew clearer, and he began to make out snippets of words. Warnings, pleas for help, and something else, something darker. The whisperers seemed to be coming from all around him, echoing through the trees, guiding him deeper into the forest. After what felt like hours, David found himself in a small clearing. In the center stood an old, gnarled tree, its trunk twisted, blackened as if it had been struck by lightning. The whispers were loudest here, almost deafening. David felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him, but he couldn't turn back now. He approached the tree, noticing that its bark was covered in strange, ancient symbols that pulsed with an eerie, unnatural light. As he reached out to touch the tree, the whispers suddenly stopped, plunging the forest into an unnerving silence. David hesitated, his hand hovering just above the bark. Something was very wrong. The air felt thick, almost as if it were pressing down on him, and the darkness seemed to close in around him. Just as he was about to pull his hand back, he felt a sharp pain shoot through his arm. He looked down and gasped in horror. His hand was sinking into the tree, the bark pulling him in a quicksand. He struggled to break free, but it was no use. The tree was absorbing him, drawing him into its twisted, blackened core. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and now David could understand them clearly. Join us. You cannot escape. You belong to the forest now. David's screams echoed through the clearing as he was pulled into the tree, his body merging with the ancient wood. The whispers grew fainter as he disappeared completely, the tree sealing itself once more, its symbols glowing ominously in the dark. When the villagers realized David had gone missing, they searched the forest but found no trace of him. They knew better than to venture too far, and eventually the search was called off. But those who dared to pass by the forest at night would sometimes hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling out from the darkness. And in the heart of the whispering forest, the ancient tree stood silent and still, its bark twisted and blackened, its roots deep in the cursed soil. But if you listened closely, you could hear the voices of those who had been claimed by the forest, their souls trapped forever within the tree's gnarled branches, whispering their eternal lamented. Megan had just started her first year of college and was excited to meet her new roommate, Emily. When she arrived at the dorm, Emily wasn't there, but her belongings were neatly arranged on her side of the room. As the days passed, Megan noticed that Emily was never around, but her bed was always made, her books neatly stacked, and her clothes perfectly folded. One night, Megan woke up to the sound of someone whispering her name. She turned on the light, but the room was empty. The next day, she asked the door manager about Emily, but the manager looked confused. "There is no Emily assigned to your room," she said. "You're supposed to be alone." Confused and frightened, Megan decided to search through Emily's belongings. Inside a notebook, she found a note written in shaky handwriting. "Don't trust her. I'm still here." That night, as Megan lay in bed, she felt a cold breath on her neck and heard a voice whisper, "You found my note, didn't you?" Megan's heart raced as she realized Emily wasn't just her roommate. Emily was still there, trapped, watching her every move. The next morning, Megan packed her things and left the dorm for good, but she could never shake the feeling that Emily was still with her, whispering in the dark. The old house on Willow Street. When Jake and his family moved to the small town of Blackwood, they were thrilled to find an old Victorian house on Willow Street, available for a great price. It was large, with plenty of room for their growing family, and it had a charm that they couldn't resist. Despite the locals' warnings about the house being haunted, they dismissed the rumors as mere superstition and eagerly moved in. The first few days were uneventful, and the family quickly settled into their new home. But soon, strange things began to happen. At night, Jake would hear faint footsteps above him, though the attic was empty. Doors would creak open on their own, and the temperature would drop suddenly, filling the room with a chill that sent shivers down his spine. One evening, Jake's daughter, Lily, came running to him, her face pale with fear. "Daddy, there's a lady in my room," she whispered, trembling. Jake tried to comfort her, saying it was just a bad dream. But when he went to check, he found the room icy cold, with the smell of roses lingering in the air, a smell that didn't belong to any of them. As the days passed, the disturbances grew more frequent and more intense. Jake's wife, Sarah, started to wake up with bruises on her arms, as if someone had gripped her tightly in the night. Objects would go missing, only to reappear in the most unexpected places. The family dog refused to go upstairs, barking and growling at something unseen at the top of the stairs. Determined to find answers, Jake started researching the history of the house. He discovered that the original owner, a woman named Elizabeth Hawthorne, had lived there in the late 1800s. She was known to be a recluse, and after her husband's mysterious death, she shut herself away from the world. The townspeople believed she had gone mad with grief. One night, she was found dead in the attic, clutching a locket with her husband's picture inside. Some said she had taken her own life, while others whispered that something more sinister had taken place. Disturbed by what he had learned, Jake decided to confront whatever was haunting their home. He went up to the attic, determined to rid the house of the spirit. As he ascended the creaky stairs, the air grew colder, and the smell of roses became overpowering. In the corner of the attic, he saw a shadowy figure, a woman dressed in a long, flowing gown, her face hidden in darkness. Jake called out to her, asking what she wanted, but she didn't respond. Instead, she began to move toward him, her form becoming more solid with each step. Jake felt an overwhelming sense of dread as the figure approached. Her eyes were hollow, filled with sorrow and rage, and her mouth twisted into a ghastly smile. Suddenly, the door to the attic slammed shut, trapping Jake inside. He could feel the cold fingers of the spirit reaching out for him, her whispers filling his mind with terror. In a panic, Jake bolted for the door, throwing it open and fleeing down the stairs. He grabbed his family, and they left the house that night, never to return. The house on Willow Street still stands, but it remains vacant to this day. The locals say that Elizabeth Hawthorne's spirit still lingers, trapped in the house where she met her tragic end. Those who dare to enter the old house often speak of the smell of roses and the sound of soft footsteps, a reminder that some spirits are never truly at rest. In a small town nestled deep within the woods, there was a place the locals rarely spoke of. a forgotten graveyard hidden in the heart of the forest. It was said that long ago, before the town was founded, there had been a small settlement on that land. The settlers faced hardships, and one winter a mysterious illness swept through the village, leaving no one alive. The dead were buried in the graveyard, and the land was abandoned, left to be swallowed by the forest. Years passed, and the town of Black Hollow grew nearby, but the graveyard was never reclaimed. Few people knew exactly where it was, and those who did avoided it at all costs. Rumors spread that the souls of the dead were restless, that the forest itself had become cursed. Despite the warnings, a group of teenagers from the town, Emma, Mark, Sarah, and Lucas, decided to explore the graveyard one night. They had heard the stories all their lives, but they were curious, eager to prove that the tales were just that, stories. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they set out on the trail that led into the forest. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The tall trees blocked out the moonlight, and the air grew colder, heavier. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the sound of their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves to break the silence. After what felt like hours, they finally arrived at the graveyard. It was a desolate place, overgrown with weeds and tangled vines. The headstones were old and crumbling, their inscriptions worn away by time. A thick fog clung to the ground, swirling around their feet as they cautiously made their way through the cemetery. "Let's split up and look around," Mark suggested, his voice trembling slightly. The others agreed, though none of them wanted to admit how uneasy they felt. As they wandered among the graves, they began to feel as though they were being watched, but whenever they turned around, there was nothing there. Emma, who had always been more sensitive to the supernatural, found herself drawn to a particular headstone at the edge of the graveyard. It was larger than the others, and though the inscription was nearly illegible, she could make out a name. Annabelle, as she stared at the name, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She felt a presence beside her, as if someone were standing just out of sight. "Emma, are you okay?" Sarah's voice broke the silence, startling her. Emma turned to see her friend approaching, but when she looked back at the headstone, she gasped. The name had changed. It now read, Emma. Before she could react, the ground beneath her began to tremble. The earth split open, revealing a dark, gaping hole. From within the grave, a hand reached out, skeletal and covered in decaying flesh. Emma screamed and tried to run, but the hand grabbed her ankle, pulling her toward the grave. Sarah rushed to help her, but as she reached out, a cold wind blew through the graveyard, carrying with it whispers of the dead. The fog thickened, and the ground seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. One by one, the other graves began to open, releasing the restless spirits trapped beneath the earth. Mark and Lucas heard Emma's screams and ran to her, but it was too late. The spirits had risen, their hollow eyes glowing with anger and despair. The teenagers were surrounded, the air thick with the stench of death. "Run!" Lucas shouted, but the spirits were upon them, their cold, bunny hands grasping at their arms, their legs dragging them toward the open graves. The fog closed in around them, and the whispers grew louder, filling their minds with images of pain and suffering. Emma struggled against the hand that held her, but its grip was too strong. She could feel herself being pulled into the grave, the earth swallowing her up. Her friends were fighting their own battles, but they were losing, dragged down by the vengeful spirits. Just as the darkness was about to claim them all, Emma felt a sudden warmth, a light piercing through the fog. She looked up to see an old woman standing at the edge of the graveyard, holding a lantern that glowed with otherworldly light. The spirits recoiled from the light, releasing their grip on the teenagers. "Leave this place now," the woman commanded, her voice echoing through the graveyard. The spirits shrieked in fury, but retreated, sinking back into their graves. The earth closed up behind them, and the fog began to dissipate. The teenagers scrambled to their feet, bruised and shaken, but alive. They didn't need to be told twice. They ran, stumbling through the forest, the old woman's light, guiding them back to the trail. When they finally emerged from the woods, they turned to thank the woman, but she was gone, vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. The teenagers never spoke of that night again. They left Black Hollow as soon as they could, carrying with them the memories of